Recording in progress.
Hi. Just push that.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Good, how are you?
Can't complain. I'm surviving.
That I don't think those two statements match up too neatly.
I think it's to truly answer that question, I probably need a glass of wine, if I'm being frank.
I get you.
Hey.
It's yeah, it's a lot. Yeah, I don't know if it's just me, but this particular past week was not it.
Yeah, it wasn't. Yeah, it's these past 3 weeks have just not been it for me. So I'm really glad it's coming to an end, and hopefully next week is a lot better because woo, child. Yeah. Sure.
There is, even in all the madness, there is still the magic of the feeling of a Friday.
This is true. This is very, very true.
It never quite loses its sparkle.
At least we've made it till Friday. But also at what cost? At what cost?
Well, that's what we're going to talk about today.
Oh, child. Oh, man. Yeah. But how have you been doing?
Yeah, I've been all right. I'm in a transitionary period.
Okay.
Where, yeah, there are, changes that need to be made. And I mean, also just like moving house, which is never really fun.
Yep.
But it's necessary. Yeah, and also getting into gear with finishing his PhD, because I'm definitely finishing it this year,
Okay.
But yeah, but I have this thing, man, where when there are other things going on that is not this main thing, but those things also need to be finished. I find it very hard to focus on the main thing.
Yeah, I get you. I get you. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember that very well.
So yeah, so it's like, I mean, we're halfway into the year, and I mean, I don't need all that time.
Yeah.
But I need to get to the place where I'm like, okay, I'm
Mhm.
doing this thing now.
Yeah, absolutely. I get you. I get you. It all comes together. I don't even know how sometimes, but I know it just all comes together eventually.
So I guess also part of it has been the, in the phase of it not quite being together, and so
Yeah.
I've I've let that get to me a little bit, because I'm
Mm,
also a person who likes certainty before I make moves, and I like things to be in a particular order,
mm,
in
mm.
me. So so without that, it's kind of been, stressful for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm kind of getting out of that and coming back to a place of you know knowing that it's fine. You can go ahead. You can make certain decisions. You can move ahead. But things will happen.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
So
I get
yeah,
it's a
I
lot.
know.
Right.
And really was not what was sold to us in the brochure.
Yep. Yep. And we were so keen to become older and become adults. Now I'm just like, why? Why?
So good.
Ooh, uh-uh.
Yeah. But anyway, here we are, as you say, surviving. Hopefully on the way to thriving
I'm
again.
hoping we can't always be in survival mode. I can't remember when last I could say I was truly thriving. It feels like it's just been one survival mode to the next, one thing to conquer, and then you immediately realize that there's this next thing to conquer. And it's just like you're always having to conquer. Can we just rest? Like,
Yeah,
can we just rest?
yeah, very that. It's actually
Mm,
part of that, what I put in. Well, I mean, I've been writing and in front.
yeah.
So a lot of content was around freedom, as it always is.
Yeah.
And I was actually very deliberate about writing about how, or at least it was about, in that particular instance, this was about my interpretation of freedom. What is freedom to
Yeah.
me? And I was like, rest. I need freedom. That freedom, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yes.
freedom is always uh, conceptualized through this lens of things that one can do or would be free to do, but it's also about what you don't do and don't have to do.
Exactly. 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 And also just not having the pressure of feeling like you constantly have to do, in terms of having a value proposition. That's definitely something that I'm still trying to work on.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
man.
Mm,
But anyway, so let me also, before we actually get started, let
okay.
me just, give you um, tone for what we're going to be doing. So um, I'm sure you noticed when you logged in, it's being recorded.
Yeah.
So we're creating the series of webinars that obviously will be made available for
Okay.
people to use, to access, to reference.
Mhm.
And there might be people who log in, there might not be.
Okay.
That's not, the crux of it.
Mhm. For sure.
Like I say, people will access this at different times at later stages.
Mhm.
Um, and so what I like to do with these things is, I don't want it to be like a boring lecture,
Yeah. Yeah.
not like 75 and shit. um, so yeah, so I like to make it a little bit more conversational, a little bit topical. And so that's kind of, the tone that I want us to create.
For sure.
Obviously, we will be guided by those themes that I know you, and of course, what you use to prepare. But where things come up and you remember something, or I say something to you and it sparks a thought, throw that in there.
For sure.
Yeah. I wanted to be like, just witnessing conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I like that. Mm.
Yeah, because I also don't feel like people need to be like, told.
Exactly.
And also, that setup kind of makes one, I don't know, at least for me, it makes one feel like you need to stick to a script, and then you actually don't remember some things that you could have seen because you're trying to remember what you're supposed to say. And so it doesn't come out so nicely like that.
Mm-hmm. Conversational is always best. I
Yeah.
find always, yeah.
Yeah. But I also think it's how we do things these days, I
Yeah.
think we were, I mean, it's obviously still going on, but we were lectured too in all the environments of learning that we found ourselves in. And we don't do things like that anymore.
Yeah.
So yeah. Okay. 5 minutes. We'll wait about 5 minutes.
Okay. I still don't know how to blur background on Zoom. To my defense, I have been using Teams a lot. So, I
Want to?
I do, but I've been going to settings and I'm just like, yes.
So what is on your side do you have those two thumbnails of the two of us?
Yes, I do.
So if you go to your thumbnail, there's a mute and next to it, there's a 3 dots.
Uh-huh.
And if you open that, then blur background is an option.
Mine says choose virtual background or choose video filter, but it doesn't have blur. That is so weird. Do you think it's an I need to update Zoom type thing? That could be it.
I have 3 options. It says blur, choose virtual, and choose.
Really? Maybe it is just, I need to update this Zoom. That's okay.
Oh, and then also the other thing I wanted to say was we have time. I mean, we won't get cut off. So, the conversation is really as long as we make it, but I aim for about an hour.
Okay.
So, but
that's fine because I'm not rushing off to anywhere. So yeah, we literally can just have a full conversation to its end.
Sure.
Yeah.
Also, I'm very proud of myself. I've been in your company for all of 15 minutes and I have resisted the urge to call you Ricardo.
I will never forget that, guys. Oh my goodness. Your faves. Your faves.
Hilarious.
I was just like, yo, but my name is right there. So yo. It's wild. That's wild. Sure. Jamil, what is the best way to get over heartbreak? I've exercised and I've read books and I've done it all, darling. I just feel like it's not working.
Ciao. Oh, morphine.
I like that one.
Participation in an opioid crisis.
Hey, yo, yeah.
Oh, we should meet up and talk about that.
Please. Also, my schedule's very flexible these days since I put my yeah. We definitely can meet up over a glass of wine.
No, definitely. Actually, I must text you.
Yes, please. I'd like that.
Okay, cool. I think we can get going.
Okay.
The introductions and all that. Welcome everyone to another Our Equity webinar. Today we have Rufaro Samanga here, who is going to be participating on the topic Dismantling the Master's House, Tools for Building a Better Future for Health. I think today we have a very important topic to discuss, something that has been very relevant throughout the health, the pandemic, and in general, I think it's a conversation that needs to be ongoing. So let me introduce our speaker before we actually get into it. Rufaro Samanga is a South African Zimbabwean epidemiologist who holds an MSc in epidemiology and biostatistics from the University of the Witwatersrand. She has experience in the predictive analysis space as well as journalism and has been a consultant for both local government and corporate entities with respect to the ongoing pandemic and vaccines in particular. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So I think your, like the confluence of your skill sets are actually something that is, I don't know, I wouldn't go out on a limb to say it's uncommon, but it's certainly an interesting mix of skill sets. Particularly, and I think we've particularly seen the relevance of it during this pandemic.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, for those who are not following what I'm saying, I'm talking about the confluence of epidemiology and journalism. Because we have had a terribly difficult time with information, particularly around, you know, the epidemiology of this pandemic. And I think about how much of that has to do with the influence of the existing oppressive structures within fields like healthcare. That unfortunately has culminated in this moment to set us back quite a bit. We could have been a lot further along had it not been for those influences. So today I wanted our conversation to focus on, yes, of course, we're going to talk about, you know, very concrete examples of what has happened throughout this pandemic, but then in general, to link it back to the impact of oppressive systems on the field of healthcare, and to situate that within a broader context for how we actually start to go about dismantling this so that we can produce better health outcomes for people.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, the first thing that I was thinking about in relation to this was the pandemic has definitely shown us how not separate the healthcare, global healthcare is from inequality. And that in fact, it's a site where inequality operates quite readily.
Yeah.
And I don't think we, I think there's at least, you know, the way that we perceive healthcare, it should be something that everybody is able to access. It only makes sense that if one is in need of healthcare, you should be able to access it. But so in context of what we've seen over the last 2 years, perhaps, would you speak a little bit to, you know, your thoughts and feelings around the inequality that we've seen within global health?
Yo, I could say a mouthful, you know, where do we start? I think, you know, any kind of national or global catastrophe always exacerbates existing conditions, right? So the pandemic has, you know, exacerbated an already failing, particularly public health system, right? And I think many of its flaws and many of the cracks within the system have really come to the fore since the beginning of the pandemic. And it's not only been in South Africa, it's been in many African countries where, you know, the public health system in general has been something that, you know, has historically and even currently been synonymous with substandard or subpar care in terms of those who need to access it. And, you know, even leaving the continent and looking at just globally, you know, you look at a superpower like the United States and how even there inequality rears its head and shows us again that even in a superpower like that, you know, there are people who are struggling to access healthcare, or where access is there, the quality, you know, is something that we have to have, you know, a conversation around, right? And there are very many things that impact, you know, one access and also the quality of that access, right? And we've seen it time and time again, whether it's here, whether it's in, you know, neighboring countries like Zimbabwe, Namibia, Mozambique, and like I said, you know, a country like the United States, maybe would think that, you know, amidst a global health emergency, everyone would have access to, you know, the ability to test for COVID-19, you know, access to masks, right? Tapping into the right kinds of policies and enacting those. And yet we've seen actually the exact opposite. You know, in some instances, we've actually seen countries like ours being able to kind of forge ahead through this pandemic a lot better than, you know, countries that have a lot more resources, a lot more money that, you know, that they throw towards the healthcare system. But again, it's all very well and good to, you know, allocate billions of dollars to a healthcare system. But if, you know, the majority of, you know, certain peoples are still living within a state of inequality, you know, that changes absolutely nothing about their daily lived reality, right? In terms of being able to access healthcare. So I think coming back, you know, closer to home, South Africa, over the past 2 years, we've really seen, I think the healthcare system has, I think, been under the spotlight, and rightly so, for good reasons. I think, you know, when we speak healthcare or public healthcare, I think pre-pandemic, it was if, you know, if something happened, maybe the roof at Charlotte Maxeke has caved in, or there's a fire, or patients are, you know, reportedly sleeping on the ground at Bara, right? It was here and there, but I think the true reality where things stand in terms of public health in South Africa, I think has really been elucidated since the beginning of the pandemic. And even more so, you know, beyond public healthcare, the healthcare system as a whole, because as you can remember, at the peak of, you know, having the most COVID, you know, 19 cases and, you know, people needing to be hospitalized, whether it was the public health system or the private health system, there simply were no beds, you know, at certain times within certain provinces, right? And so the gaps really started to show, and perhaps maybe not as glaringly in the private healthcare sector, right? Because there's a lot of money, there's a lot of resources, and, you know, certain things that come with private ownership. But the gaps were there nonetheless, right? And it showed us that, you know, there can be money and there can be not money, but again, access is a legitimate thing, right? If you don't have access even to, you know, a public hospital like Bara or Helen Joseph or Charlotte Maxeke and all the rest, and your only access point for healthcare is a local local clinic that is already overburdened, it's understaffed, it's under-resourced, they can't get tests, not even the rapid antigen test, let alone the PCR testing, access then really becomes a very tangible problem, right? Because you don't know whether you've got the flu, is it the cold, is it COVID-19? And, inequality is not something that works in a silo. If, you're an individual that's affected by that, chances are your immediate family, your community is also, likely going to be affected by inequality. So it becomes a much larger problem that is beyond just one individual. It affects communities, it affects an entire society. So one, I think, the pandemic really has, to summarize, brought public health care and healthcare as a whole to the fore, in the country. It's really shown us where the gaps, the cracks are, the things that, we don't have and haven't had for a long time. It's shown us how we haven't been maintaining infrastructure as well as we should have, which I think in South Africa is just, a theme that seems to be ongoing, whether we're looking at healthcare, whether we're looking at other sectors. And it's also shown us that, it's not just rhetoric, right? We could talk about inequality, we can talk about access, it can sound, very scholarly, but the real life effects of people not being to access healthcare is that people die, right? So kids no longer have parents, they no longer have siblings, they no longer have, family members, friends, people who form part of their very close, knit communities, loved ones. And that is the repercussion when, people do not have equitable access to healthcare. So I think just as a snapshot, those are some of the kind of the major points that I would want to kind of highlight in terms of just, healthcare in this country, especially in the midst of the ongoing pandemic.
And as you were speaking, I mean, one of the things that came to mind was, you're talking about people having to go to a clinic or a hospital and trying to get tested because they don't know whether they have a cold or COVID-19. But then, of course, there was the other impact of, COVID-19 admissions to hospital that then pushed out people's surgeries, elective surgeries, so that's another knock-on effect of, of that. So to the point of impacting access, right? So you were scheduled to have a surgery that, had serious consequences for your life, and now that has to be pushed out because of this. So just to the point that you made about it not existing in a silo, and also the fact that it's a chain reaction.
Absolutely.
So when we talk about recovering from this, we're not only talking about recovering from the impact of the pandemic, we are on people who have been ill because of the virus. We're also talking about the impact of people who had other kinds of illnesses that needed to be attended to that have now been delayed or pushed out or cancelled, and how that has then further impacted their health. And to catch up to that, I don't think it's quite such a, it's not an easy task.
Yeah. And I think that's a beautiful point to bring up because, I always talk very openly about, losing my father to the public health system. And again, on the issue of exacerbating, an already strained condition, if before COVID-19, you had people on a waiting list to, for example, get a colonoscopy done, right? And they're having to wait maybe about 2 months. Can you imagine now during the pandemic, if that's being pushed out by a couple of months, how long is that individual having to wait? In the case of my father, waiting 2 months, because they didn't have enough staff, they couldn't get him, a surgeon, and he had colon cancer and he eventually died. So can you imagine, people who have, stage 1 cancer or who have, tumors that are potentially malignant, but, because they've been caught early, we can operate. But now you've got this pandemic and you already had to wait a month or 2. Now that's been pushed out because we have all of these admissions. We don't have beds, all the stuff we're rerouting to COVID because it's a lot more pressing. You're having to wait maybe an additional 3 to 4 months or even more, depending on the hospital itself. And in real life terms, that means a lot of people are potentially dying as a result, right? Because sometimes waiting is literally the difference between whether someone is recovering from a specific condition or whether they're actually going to eventually succumb to that condition. So yeah, it's a very good point, outside of people who are suffering from COVID and all the other kind of difficulties that come with that. The healthcare system is not just for handling COVID-19. There's so many other ailments and sicknesses and conditions. What about people who are on dialysis? Did that affect them? People who routinely come into the hospital and they need certain, ongoing treatments, that has a knock-on effect, right? So it then is not just about the burden of COVID-19, but what is the ripple effect of the pandemic on other conditions, right? And other patients' ability to access, a certain kind of care and a certain level of care as well.
Yeah.
Mm.
And it also just, reminds me of, we had a webinar yesterday on war and violence and those knock-on effects. And one of the panelists, who is Dorothy Kalata, who is the daughter of Paul Kalata, who is one of the Craddock Four, was talking about, a society in which we don't have or don't care to have an understanding of the fact that people have a right to live.
Yeah.
And I mean, when you're talking about that, and people's surgeries being pushed out and that being the difference between whether they succumb or whether they recover, in a system like that, which is extremely unfortunate, but a healthcare system is also just, it's an administrative system, right? It's about numbers and beds and all of these things. And the fact that people have a right to live does not always actually filter into the decision-making about who gets a bed and who doesn't, And again, so that issue of access then impacts on our ability to care for who lives and who dies.
Yeah.
But with that said, I'm thinking about the other aspect of the consequences of this lack of access to an already strained, in many ways failing healthcare system. However, the only healthcare system that people can actually use.
Yeah.
And on top of that, during this time, we have seen gross violations of people's right to information through organized misinformation campaigns that put doubt in people's minds about already failing healthcare system.
Yeah.
And I think that's also had a lot of consequences for the handling of the pandemic, and then also the handling of people's lives, But I want to juxtapose that, right? So yes, there has been genuine misinformation, but I want to juxtapose that with also then a history of mistreatment by the healthcare system of particularly marginalized people. I think about, in the States, I think about Henrietta Lacks.
Yeah.
I think about the Tuskegee syphilis study. In South Africa, about women being having hysterectomies against their will, the administering of Depo-Provera to women as contraceptives, and the consequences that has had long term. And so there's misinformation, and then you juxtapose that with the genuine mistrust that marginalized people have of the healthcare system that historically has caused them a lot of harm. And what do we do with that? I mean, so now I'm kind of pulling in your journalistic experience, for this. How do we work with this and combat it? Because there are definitely two sides to the story.
Absolutely. I think, and this is something that's come up with, for me quite a lot. I think from a journalistic perspective, when the pandemic began, there was a lot of misinformation doing the rounds, and misinformation is nothing new. I mean, there's misinformation around, pretty much everything. But I think once you have a global health emergency such as this, I think, the rate at which that misinformation travels and just the sheer volume of it, exponentially increases. And, I started, seeing a lot of things, whether it was on WhatsApp, those chain messages, or it was on Facebook or Twitter, just a lot of misinformation that I was like, this would be pretty easy to address, in a little article, very brief, And so I started, writing these articles about, COVID-19 and vaccines in particular, because at that time we were starting to have the conversation about, what is going to become the standard of care when it comes to treating COVID. And of course, vaccines were at the top of that list, right? Outside of palliative treatment. So, I started writing about, I remember the first article I wrote was about vaccines in general, and I called it the good, the bad, and the misinformation, right? So I think when we have a conversation, especially that, has historically where misinformation has played quite a big role, and also you're looking at the mistreatment, especially of marginalized groups, it's very important to have a full conversation, right? So I think oftentimes what medical professionals or healthcare professionals want to do is they just want to get kind of to the meat of the conversation and say, well, vaccines work, so XYZ, so you should trust us, take us at our word. And I think, sometimes there just genuinely isn't enough time to address both the misinformation and then, going about doing the actual work. But I think, when it is possible, it's quite valuable. And that's what I learned as well, that, we can talk about the value that vaccines have, right? But on the same hand, we also need to talk about historically, why is there a distrust, right, in the medical and the healthcare community when it comes to vaccines, right, or when it comes to certain medications or certain, the running of clinical trials, right? It's not that that has come from absolutely nowhere. It's not that it's just pure conspiracy theory and it shouldn't be addressed, right? Some of the examples that you mentioned, are stuff that I've also mentioned in my writing and said there is legitimate, reason for distrust in the medical community, because there's so many abhorrent things that have happened in the name of science or in the name of medicine. And, they've targeted Black people, people of color, queer people, and so many other marginalized individuals and communities. It's only right that when you have a conversation about all the pros and the advantages and, the values of whatever it is that you're talking about, right? Whether it's service or whether it's a standard of care or whether it's a new medication, whether it's a vaccine, you also have to speak to the heart of the issue, which is fundamentally fear, right? So people are afraid that the things that happened in the past can possibly happen again, right? And they want to be reassured that what are some of the structures or the frameworks or the ways in which, science and medicine is conducted now that is going to safeguard them, that is going to protect them, that is going to make sure that they too, right, get to maintain their humanity and their dignity when they're trying to access healthcare, which is something that in the past, time and time again, was something that may not have been possible, right? So I think it's always very important to say, hey, when we're talking about, the history, how medicine and science has come a long way, we can't just speak about, all the advances and all, the shiny, bright lights of, medicine and scientific advancements. We also have to speak to the dark side, right? Because also, unfortunately, in as much as, some of these things, could potentially not happen today, there is still a level of, unethical practices, right, when it comes to healthcare. So that's something we can't just say, oh, no, it just used to happen in the past, it doesn't happen anymore. And that would be completely disingenuous, right? So I think also just looking at contemporary medicine and healthcare, there's still a lot of things that are happening within hospitals, within clinics, within healthcare institutions, where people who have historically been harmed as a result of medicine and health and healthcare are still being harmed. We might not be, running an unethical trial on, giving Black men syphilis, right? Or giving Black women a particular contraceptive we know is going to be harmful to them, right? Or running a whole, bunch of experiments that were being run in the past, predominantly by white male scientists, but there still is a fair level of, unfair, unethical, and very harmful practices taking place in contemporary medicine and healthcare. And again, those are some of the things that we need to address if we're going to have a genuine conversation that says, this is something that is valuable to society, to specific communities, but the only way we're going to get buy-in is not by dismissing them and making them seem as if their mistrust is uncalled for, or, it has no legitimate basis, because it does, and I think any, scientist or medical professional worth their salt would acknowledge that, right? I think there has been quite a, very deep level of harm that has been, that has been perpetuated by, the medical community. And I think it's going to take years, for society as a whole to be trusting of the medical community. So, I'm never offended by skepticism when people are like, yeah, but I'm not sure about that. I don't know, I don't think necessarily when people express skepticism, it's because, they think they know so much more than a medical professional. Sometimes it's my lived experience is that, people who look like me have been treated in a certain way, and to some degree, they are still being treated in a certain way, and so I need to see something shift. I need to see something change in order for me to believe that, this society, this healthcare as a system is something that also caters to me and not to a select group of individuals. Yeah. So I think it has to be a whole conversation. We can't, talk about the good without addressing the bad. I think it goes hand in hand, and I think we'll do a lot more good. We'll go along a longer way in terms of addressing misinformation and, fostering trust in different communities if we address that these are some of the very crappy things that have happened in the past, but this is how things have changed, or if they haven't changed, this is how things can potentially change, and these are some of the agents of change that can allow that to happen within, some of the existing frameworks.
Yeah. While you're speaking, I was thinking the other angle that I want to bring into the conversation, right, is the practice or the lack thereof of ethics in media. Right?
Yeah.
So we're talking about misinformation, whereas like people start the rumors on chain messages on WhatsApp and all of these things. But I don't think that we should be naive to think that media entities themselves are not ruled by politics, right? And so I mean, in the same way that that medical professionals come with their own biases and prejudices, and therefore they practice medicine in alignment with those views. So do editors in newsrooms, right? If you have a racist editor, probably not going to allow you to run a story about the history of harm perpetrated against Black people by the medical community.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to ask, let me ask the question, what is the scope for using the media as a and I'm saying media as a generic term, right? But how easy is it actually then in media spaces to do good ethical work when one is also faced with such obstacles?
It's a tough one, and I know, the rhetoric is often, just make sure you're, reading from a reputable, media organization. What does that even mean? Because even those that we deem reputable, right? If I look at some of the coverage that's gone on, for COVID-19, I've read it and I'm like, this is absolute BS, right? How could an editor allow this to run? So you see that the media is really a function of very many things, like you mentioned. It's not, it doesn't preclude politics. I think that plays a huge role. And again, also it's a function of who are your superiors as a writer, who is your immediate writer, who's the editor-in-chief, what are their own prejudices and biases, right? And it also just, what is the history of that publication? It might be called News 24 today, but what was it, back in the day, and some of these other publications, in my kind of 3 years as a journalism, I, thankfully worked for an organization that gave me a lot of carte blanche to write whatever I wanted to write, right? As long as I, followed, certain journalistic practices, there was, an ethical code and all of that. But I could write about, I remember I wrote a story about how at the beginning of the pandemic, more Black British people were succumbing to COVID-19 than their white counterparts, right, in England. And, I wonder, would the Daily Mail, for example, in the UK publish such a story? I don't know, and it was backed up by, academic papers and was ongoing studies, but this was the trend that they were observing. So, if you find yourself in a newsroom that says, oh, race doesn't have a place in healthcare, well, that's, absolutely not true, because even as a health care professional, I can tell you that race is definitely, a major factor, especially when we're dealing with, pandemics, because again, inequality in and of itself is racial, right? And so you cannot separate race from something like COVID-19 or any of the other, pandemics or epidemics that we've had in the past, or any other conditions, really, when we talk about, healthcare as a whole. So when it comes to, reputable media, ethical reporting, it's very difficult to know what the facts are, who is telling the facts, who is telling all of the facts, who's telling just a part of the story, because sometimes it's not that people are necessarily peddling things that are false. Sometimes they just don't give the whole story, because again, sensationalism in media is a thing, right? It gets the clicks, it gets people buying newspapers. And so sometimes you're not going to say the study found that XYZ caused whatever. You're going to say, something that's a little bit more provocative. It's going to get, people going. It's going to rile them up. And, that lends itself to unethical, practices, because people rarely read a whole article, right? People are retweeting on the basis of, a headline or a subheader. And again, that's how the cogs of misinformation keep turning, right? Because one, you've got journalists who know very well that, when people are not really clicking on the article itself, they're either, sharing or retweeting or reposting just on whatever social media platform that is, because they can always tell, how long has a person, taken on, a particular page. Does that mean that they've actually read the article? They have all of that, those analytics, right? It's the stuff we sit in, meetings and discuss. How do we get, clicks onto the page? How do we make sure that people are staying on the page and whatnot? So these are things that writers, and especially journalists, especially for online media, are very well aware of, right? And I think the unethical sort of practices start to creep in when there's a complete disregard for what people are sharing, and whether they are sharing the whole sort of story when it comes to whatever is being told. It's really more just, well, as long as we've got, 12,000 retweets on the story. But when you actually go and read the story, you're like, but this is not what it's saying at all. And I think we've actually started seeing, especially with certain publications, where the headline and the subheader actually have absolutely nothing to do with the story, right? That's just like how the level of deterioration, because I often, will go on a story that seems to have been quite popular on social media. And I'm like, I bet a lot of people haven't actually read the story, and I'll click on it and I'll read the story. Sometimes it's just a paragraph that's saying absolutely nothing. But again, it's the headline and the subheader that's gotten people riled up. One, they haven't bothered to go and actually read the article, because then they'll see that there's very little to the article itself, or they'll say it's a developing story. But again, even in publishing something that is developing, you also need to make sure that when that first article goes up, right, there's enough information to go on, right? Otherwise, again, you're steering towards more sensationalism than ethical and ethical reporting that has integrity, right? And I think for a lot of, especially online publications, that's definitely been the strategy. And again, that's also a function of who's in charge. If, the bottom line is we need to make sure that we've got so many clicks because we need to, go into the end of month meeting and say we got so many clicks, so therefore the advertising that, you're paying us for is warranted. Sometimes that's the bottom line. So we don't care whether misinformation is spreading or not. not. So I think a lot of publications are really teetering on the edge, if not over the edge, of just constantly being a little more unethical, because unfortunately the bottom line isn't is society or is the public well informed. It's really, can we use the public or society for our bottom line, which is profit, and to make sure we have the clicks, we keep our advertisers, because if we don't, we have, there's the potential for us, having to lay off people or to close down entirely. So yeah, I think the issue of ethics is so varied, because it's, are we looking at it from, how is the political sort of landscape influencing journalism? Are we looking at the intra-politics of the newsroom itself, whether you have a racist or a prejudiced editor or editor-in-chief who is funding the publication? Because sometimes you might have someone who's like, we're going to run the story, but if you have a big, advertiser who is, maybe contributing 60% of, revenue, are you going to run the story at the expense of, losing that advertiser? And, maybe you as an editor or as an editor-in-chief might be willing to take that risk, right? But, the people who handle the business of journalism, because again, journalism is not only, for the good of the public and society and making sure they're well informed. There's also, unfortunately, the business of it, and oftentimes it's the lack of ethics there that starts to trickle in to the actual practice of ethical journalism. So I think it's quite varied, and it's a function of very many things. So it really does become difficult to say, hey, that article that was posted by this particular publication or versus that one is or is not reputable, right? Because it can be on very many levels. And, sometimes they'll get it right. Certain publications that have been way off in terms of the reporting have also done some good reporting, right? On the same pandemic, and, things like inequality, and how is, a community like Khayelitsha, responding to the pandemic versus us, who are in a metropolis like Johannesburg. So yeah, it's a function of many things, but definitely I would say, as someone who's also been in that space, that there are a number of publications I've looked at who I thought, for the most part have been fairly reputable and would not risk their good name, that they've, in many instances just kind of thrown ethics out the window, and they've rushed to have the most sensational, the most, provocative story online, whether it's true or not, or speaks to, the essence of a study that's been conducted, or how it actually impacts the people that it's actually, speaking about. So yeah, in a roundabout way, that's what I've kind of, been looking at as it pertains to journalism, the pandemic, and ethics in this country. Yeah.
Yeah, and it then takes me to another important cog in the system around this pandemic, is how like National Department of Health, for example, has completely absconded of their responsibility to create and put out reliable and good and understandable public health messaging, right?
Yeah.
So then people start relying on the media. Now we've already painted a picture of what happens internally with the media, how many factors play a role in deciding what gets put out by media. And so, I mean, so I really liked that we've put this in the conversation, because I'm trying to paint a picture of how, with regards to the outcomes eventually, the consequences of this do not come from one source, right? We have a healthcare system that is overburdened, that is failing, that has had serious consequences for people. Then we have an entity in which information is provided that people ought to rely on in order to be able to protect themselves or understand better what is happening around them. That in itself also has great potential to be compromised, and in many instances is. And then we have like I say, government department that is
Yeah.
also responsible for making sure that this information reaches the people. And again, has not. I mean, would you agree that throughout the Department of Health has done a very poor job of public health messaging?
Yeah. And, oh boy, it's caused me a lot of frustration, to the point where just from a career perspective, I've wondered, do I remain in, the sort of the traditional conventional route of public health? Do I go private because there seems to be a lot more pull there, but it also seems to be, a greater focus on policy. And if the policies aren't there, then, you can't do the work on the ground. So it's caused quite an existential crisis for me as someone who cares very deeply about healthcare, but more so public healthcare, right? And I think, like I said before, I think it's a prevailing theme when it comes to leadership and governance in this country. There's just a lack of accountability. A lot of the work that I did for local government when it came to the messaging around COVID-19 and vaccines education in particular was for every other department except for health, right? And when you look at the amount of money that they have that they could spend on comms and marketing campaigns, and healthcare professionals who are a little unconventional like me, that aren't sitting in a lab or sitting in an office crunching numbers, that are saying, hey, we have these varied skill sets. We want to make sure that the public is getting the right information. We want to create dashboards where people are able to go on and say, hey, I heard XYZ about COVID-19. Is it true? Is it a myth, right? There's so many healthcare professionals and like-minded individuals who have the expertise, right? And who want and have the willingness to do the work, right? That the public needs. But the Department of Health, and more so the National Department of Health, is not interested, right? And there's a lack of accountability there, but we know that everything really fundamentally boils down to corruption. So when the Minister of Health, or the former Minister of Health, Zweli Mkhize, is entangled in this digital vibe scandal where millions are going to this very illegitimate communications company, that is money that could otherwise have been spent doing the work that would have been dispelling misinformation. Misinformation would have meant fewer people would have stayed at home denying the existence of COVID-19. They would have gone to the hospitals, right? We would have been able to manage the burden on the public healthcare system a lot better than we were able to, right? And so you see, again, leadership and governance doesn't exist in the silo where, they either are terribly, governing or not terribly governing. It always has a ripple effect, right? So corruption leads to not being able to do this. The funds are not funneled into the right channels. And again, I think this is where private healthcare always has a one-up, because the bottom line is always profit. It's always, making sure shareholders have X, Y, Z. There's almost in fact, there is an incentive to, and this is not to say that there isn't corruption in private, the private sector or private healthcare. Absolutely is. But I think because there's always this bottom line, there's always going to be this incentive to make sure that certain things are done, like come hell or high water, certain things need to be done to make sure that the system as a whole is functioning, right? And, the services and the goods that it's supposed to be offering, it's offering at a certain level, right? I think in the public healthcare system, especially when it comes to the National Department of Health, good governance is not enough of an incentive. It just isn't. And it's not even limited to healthcare. People just don't care. And unfortunately, within the healthcare system, that has very real ramifications in that your health minister is doing XYZ, the MSCs are often just, really faces more than they are, people who are willing to make sure that we have these great policies, but why are they not being enacted, right? And I think that's the thing with South Africa across the board. When you look at, our level of policy making, right? Absolutely amazing. Even when we look at the environment, right? Our legislature there is brilliant, but time and time again, where we fall short is enacting these policies, right? So on paper, everything sounds amazing. On paper, the public health system should be a well-run, well-oiled machine, right? Given the funding that goes into it, the structures of governance. I mean, hell, hospitals even have CEOs. I didn't know that until I started doing my master's. And again, good governance simply isn't enough of an incentive for people to do the necessary work, right? And so yeah, I have very many critiques when it comes to the National Department of Health. If we look at provinces like the Eastern Cape, where how can a Department of Health, have to be put under administration because they simply have no funds? What does that mean for a hospital? We no longer have, just very basic normal medications that people would require on a daily basis, let alone the equipment and high tech that we would need to do other things, right? So honestly, I think it boils down to governance, which in this case is the lack of it. For a long time, we haven't had someone who could really enthuse the entire department to want to govern well, to want to do well. And, it really is a top-down thing. We have very many critiques about nurses and doctors on the ground. And, whilst that can be a conversation, on its own, it's also, again, a function of their superiors. If your superior is not interested in, your bedside manner, how are you treating patients, whether patients are sitting on the floor or waiting in long queues or are able to get medication or not, then it's very difficult for, individual public health professionals to want to do their best. And of course, you've got excellent public health professionals who care, and that sincerity and that empathy and that compassion is there. But I don't think it exists on a big enough scale, simply because the people sitting right at the top who call the shots, who make the decisions and have the influence and the power to change things, they're not interested. And if the only incentive you have is good governance and not much else, there are no ramifications for your bad behavior. Zweli Mkhize has been cleared. He's, preparing to be some presidential candidate. It just becomes a system where, people either do what they want or they just simply don't do anything at all. And unfortunately, the people who suffer as a result of that are the people who need access to healthcare. But unfortunately, the National Department of Health and even the local departments of health in the various provinces have just, I think for a good number of years, have just not done good enough by people. And again, there is no incentive for them to do the work. And so things will largely remain the same, and then they'll continue to deteriorate. I think that's just how it always goes. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so I think what we've done up until now with this discussion is we've taken a tour to the different rooms of the master's house.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that's really what I wanted to do with this discussion, was to speak about the different components of what makes public health so inequitable.
Yeah.
Yes, in relation to the pandemic, but also just, in general, because I think public health messaging, for example, around various health concerns should be an ongoing thing. It's not a thing that needed to pop up during COVID-19. Ethical reporting on health in the media is not something that needed to only become a concern now. It should have been ongoing. So that's the master's house that we are sitting with right now, and the impact of again, like I'm fascinated by the perception which exists that these things are they're all divorced from the politics that we squabble about on a daily basis. Well, this one's racist and that one's a capitalist and that one's as if those influences do not find themselves embedded in the foundations of systems like public health and government and media. So with the time that we have left, and yesterday I did a webinar, and at the end of it, we do try to have a little bit of a conversation
Yeah.
about solutions,
Yeah.
and those aren't always easy to communicate. But I said to my panelists yesterday, with your response, please be as utopian as you want to be. Because I do think there's value in creating that hope for how things could be,
Yeah. Yeah.
So now that we've taken a tour through the master's house that is public health, um, what do you think are the tools that we could possibly utilize? Because I do think the other thing is, I do think these things exist. It's just the usage and the implementation.
Yeah.
What do you think are the tools that we could possibly use to dismantle this house?
I think, the house being, a metaphor for the system, these structures, fundamentally, but all these things are people, right? So when you talk about, racist structures and systems, fundamentally, it boils down to racist people who, who hold very prejudiced views. So I think, and as corny and cliche as it may sound, we genuinely just need a new generation of leaders across the board. We need a new generation of leaders within the media space, right? People for whom ethical journalism is non-negotiable, right? We need a new generation of leaders within, medicine and public health, right? For whom compromising healthcare for any South African, citizen, any individual at all at that is non-negotiable. We need people who sit in policy making, rooms, who are also of the mindset that, it's not enough for policy to just exist. What are we doing on the implementation end of things? As an example, South Africa has, in its laws, it says that if an individual is in an accident and they happen to not be on medical aid, right? It doesn't matter, the first ambulance that arrives on the scene, whether it's private or whether it's public, right? They need to take them to the nearest hospital. And if the nearest hospital happens to be a private hospital, they have to receive life-sustaining care until they can be transferred to the nearest public hospital. And I've stopped on, a number of occasions and someone's been hit by a motorbike or a car and I've gotten out to help. And I remember the last time that I did that, it was a woman, she was lying in the middle of the road and 3 ambulances passed by. Each time they stopped, they asked, is she on medical aid? And we'd say no, and then they drive by. The next one would come, is she on medical aid? No, they drive by. The state ambulance never arrived. So we called private, we called public, the state ambulance just simply never arrived. And I think she was about maybe not more than 5 kilometers away from Helen Joseph, right? So even, the distance from, the nearest public hospital and where she wasn't even that far, but, the state couldn't even bring an ambulance to the scene. It's only the 4th private ambulance that then stopped and one of the paramedics got out and they started, administering life-sustaining care. But if we had people who said, hey, we have this law and it exists, and we need to make sure that it's not just a policy that sits on paper, but it's something that's implemented and enacted across the board, we definitely have fewer people dying, and I think for me, it's just tremendously frustrating that the difference between, you lying on the side of the road and getting help or not getting help and potentially dying is really a function of you not having money. And I think in a capitalist system, because again, we can't divorce capitalism from everything else, right? I think it is the underpinnings of very many of these systems. It cannot be that within healthcare and when we talk about people's lives, that we're still looking at the bottom line. We're still looking at some profit, right? And someone can just lie on the side of the road and not come back home because they didn't have enough money to save their own lives, right? So I think really when I think of tools, right, I really do think about qualities, right? And characteristics that as human beings, we need to have. Integrity is certainly one of them, right? As a healthcare professional, I can't say to someone who is queer presenting, well, I don't believe in XYZ, so I'm not going to treat you. And I don't think that you deserve a certain kind of care. And unfortunately, we have very many healthcare professionals who have certain prejudices and biases which affect the level and the standard of care that, again, marginalized individuals and marginalized communities, have access to. And that, again, is an issue. It's not enough for someone like me who is, a cis heterosexual Black woman to receive amazing care, but, someone else to not, right? That is not equitable. But again, who's addressing those differences? Who's standing up within the healthcare community and saying that is not right? Whatever your prejudices might be, when it comes to healthcare, this is what the law says. This is what the Constitution says. This person has a right to dignity, but they also have a right to life. And I think that's at the fundamental that's the crux of this conversation, right? When we talk about healthcare, it's systems, it's administration, it's how do we do this better? How do we not do this? But really at the core of it, it's, acknowledging that every single human being, whether they're South African, whether they're not, whether they're an undocumented foreign national, they have the right to life, right? And insofar as that pertains to healthcare, we need to be making sure that every single individual, no matter the background that they come from, no matter who they are, their sexual orientation, their gender, whatever the case may be, they have a shot, and I've written so many times about how public health care, unfortunately, in Africa especially, has become synonymous with death, right? People go in and they don't know if they're going to come out. And I think if nothing else, we just need to be able to give people a shot, especially people who historically have just not even had that shot to begin with, right? And I wish there were more concrete things that I could speak to, but unfortunately, because these systems and these structures exist because of people, we have to speak to the people element. One must have integrity. One can't be, partial to this person and not that person. When we talk about equity, we also have to talk about fairness, and how you treat one person compared to how you treat another person is, something that we see a lot, right? Especially in terms of South African healthcare. And someone has to have the courage to say that this is not okay, and actually start saying that, well, the policy supports, the fact that this is not okay. So how do we make sure that individuals who are not in alignment with this are not within the healthcare system? I think in as much as we have, passionate, compassionate, empathetic individuals within the healthcare system, something that we are not currently doing is actively weeding out people who should not be within the healthcare system, right? And again, that might be a function of course, unemployment within the country, and these things are intertwined and interlinked. But again, it's either there are individuals for whom there is recourse, people who we can say, hey, these are some of the things that are integral to, fair, equitable healthcare. And, there are people who are going to be convinced that, yeah, sure, I might have had these prejudices and biases, but, within the context of healthcare, it's not acceptable. But there are those individuals who are not interested in making sure that people have equitable access. There are people who fundamentally actually just want to prevent certain individuals and groups and communities from accessing healthcare. And that is very harmful, and we talk about the Hippocratic Oath that doctors and public health professionals like myself take, it is the antithesis of that entire statement and that entire, that oath. So I think also there has to be a very deliberate and active weeding out of harmful individuals who should not be within the healthcare system at all, right? And then it's asking ourselves as a society in general, how do we then espouse certain, qualities and characteristics, especially for individuals who are tasked with people's lives and ensuring that, people get better, people access healthcare, and people are able to access healthcare, on behalf of their loved ones. So I want there to be like a silver bullet, like, let's do this, and, we would have fixed healthcare. But I think as with many problems in society, there are so many things that need to come together and coalesce. But I think fundamentally it's people. And I think we need to espouse certain characteristics. We need to be able to say medical professionals and public health professionals must conduct themselves with integrity. What is integrity? They must have compassion. They must be empathetic. It can't just be rhetoric. It can't be things that are ticked off in an exam when people are at med school. These are things we continuously need to be harping on about, but we also need to make sure that there are ramifications for individuals who are not willing to be that way, and who have no interest in making sure that healthcare is accessible to all. I think in many other industries, maybe it I don't know, it's okay to have individuals who are fundamentally an
I wonder, this might be.
Sorry about that. So load shedding just hit at an hour. It should
This
not
might be the
be.
consequence of load shedding.
Goodness. So yeah, that just completely, whenever load shedding hits, my laptop is absolutely useless. So I'm on my phone now. So I hope that the signal isn't too bad. But yeah, all I was saying is, I think the fundamental is people, and especially when it comes to healthcare, because you're dealing with people's lives, I think there must be a much higher standard in terms of the things that we are willing to accept and we are not willing to accept. And I think from a policy level, a governance level, an ethics level, and right down to the medical practitioner or the nurse that you are seeing, all of that has to be in alignment. But again, it takes good governance to get all of those things to work together, in a way that brings about a system that is healthy and that is, fundamentally valuable and beneficial to, the individuals it is supposed to be serving.
Yeah, and beyond needing, those kinds of people, we also need to think so seriously about being those kinds of people.
Exactly. That is really important. Yeah. I think it's what I call, the spirit of significance. I think very oftentimes we expect someone else to be that thing or to have that characteristic. But I often wonder, how many times do we expect it of ourselves to show up as people of integrity?
Yeah.
Who are, resistant to systems of oppression, right? So I do think it definitely starts in one's own house, before we can actually, start to dismantle, the master's house, so to speak. So yeah, you bring up a very pertinent point. Yeah.
And I mean, within that, I believe also there's, this is something that we'll tackle in a later webinar, particularly in relation to medical education.
Yeah.
But the fact that in many of these disciplines, especially the STEM disciplines, medicine, all of those things, there needs to be greater collaboration with humanities.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's absolutely unbelievable that for so long the idea has persisted that you can treat human beings without having to concern yourself with the reality of what it means to be a human being in a society.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think also, again, it speaks to society, South Africa in particular, and something that irks me quite a lot, it is the undervaluing of the humanities, right? Especially, certain humanities fields or professions over others, right? So, lawyers might get a little bit more respect than others, but it's always confused me because, you cannot be in the business of people and care very little about people and want to know very little about people themselves, And I've always found that, very interesting when I was, I think, doing my honors in the sciences, there was a compulsory ethics course, right? It was called, what was it? The philosophy behind science, and it looked at ethical dilemmas within, science, and it addressed some of, the ethical, travesties that have happened in the past, right? And I found it so valuable because and maybe it's, the whole loving English, loving science, and, being appreciative of both. But, I can tell you the rest of the class did not want to do that course. They found it a waste of time. They're like, how is this going to better my ability in the laboratory? How is this going to increase my likelihood of getting a job with one of the big biotech companies? And so that is an issue, right? But I think also it presents an opportunity, right? If we're going to talk about solutions, how can we revise the curriculum within medicine and also the sciences? I definitely think that, ethics and philosophy, things like sociology, all of those things should be part and parcel of a good science curriculum. We can't be talking about electrons or treating a patient, but, not engaging in some of these very important, conversations that, I'm quite envious of in terms of, how the humanities go about it. So I think there has to be a revising of the curriculum, sciences, health sciences, medicine, all of that, right? In fact, I would, even go as far as to say that everybody needs to be learning about the humanities, whether you're in engineering or whatnot, because again, none of the professions that we're engaged in are devoid of people. People are often at the center, in some way, in one way or the other. And so I think, the humanities should really form, part and parcel of the foundation of any scientist, especially a scientist who's, going to be responsible for a person's well-being, as well as, their overall lives. I think that's very important. And I think making sure that that's something that is emphasized, especially at a curriculum level from undergrad all the way up into postgrad, right? Even in your PhD, you still need to be engaging with that, not just as okay, we'll do it in first year and then that's the end of it. I think from, we need to set the tone and set the pace, and it needs to be something that, is entrenched within the curriculum up until, whether it's honors or masters or PhD. And I think also as sort of as a secondary thing, that will also, I think, if nothing else, change the way that the humanities are perceived within this country, right? I think very oftentimes they're just sidelined, they're seen as non-important. There's a very ignorant conversation about, yeah, but where are you going to work and what job are you going to do? And I think, at least in my personal life, some of the most thoughtful, some of the most substantive individuals who are excellent at their work are actually not scientists, but they're actually humanities students. They are philosophers, people who have studied bioethics, and for me, I'm learning incredibly from them. And I think that is something that everyone like me, whether it's an engineering student or a health science student or, a med student, should be doing as well. So I think if we're talking about accountability and, how can the National Department of Health step up, let's revise the curriculum and make sure that we're incorporating the humanities, because I think overall, in terms of the professionals that we would then be producing for this country, I think it would generally change the perception about what healthcare is, what people deserve, and what should be a non-negotiable when we're talking about access.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have Sean, who's just made a comment to say, I couldn't agree more. The undervaluing of the humanities is to our very own detriment. Moreover, the undervaluing prevents us from coming up with effective solutions when engaged in the solution space. Yeah. And I would add, I think it's very telling, and it tells a sad story, but it's very telling that many people's first reaction is to scoff at a discipline called humanities.
Yeah.
I mean, the word in itself is something, is something that should resonate you know. And when we think about how how the word came about, I mean, what is its root? Humanity. And for us to scoff at that makes a much bigger statement about the society that we live in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So with that said, thank you so much, Rufaro, for your generosity of thought and time. I think, I think the discussion has really made a valuable contribution to the ways in which we think about not only, you know, the cracks within public health, but how all the different parts of the story, if you will, actually fit together to create the problem that we are trying to undo, and that we cannot approach it from one angle only.
Absolutely. It's definitely a pronged approach, but I think also it's just getting buy-in, you know, from people in different spaces, you know, people wanting, you know, to achieve the same goal. But I think also fundamentally it's just, you know, people have to be enraged by the current condition of things for them to want things to change. I think if people are comfortable and they're complacent and they're like, well, I don't have to use, you know, the public healthcare system. I'm part of the 23% that's on medical aid and I get to use private healthcare. That's a problem there, you know. So I think, you know, even people who don't necessarily, you know, participate in the public healthcare system, who might not have to seek healthcare from there, we also need their buy-in, right? And I think really at its core, it's just being enraged by the current condition of things and saying that there is a potential for public health to not be synonymous with substandard and subpar and death. But again, it's going to take a collective effort and rising above just a bottom line and, you know, the desire for profit under this, you know, capitalistic system. So definitely a collective effort, but I am very much I'm hopeful, because when I look at, you know, some of my peers, you know, and their kind of enthusiasm, you know, and the resistance against, you know, this shouldn't be here and this shouldn't be happening, you know, I'm quite hopeful that things have the ability to change. And in some instances are changing. Sometimes, you know, the change is just, you know, it's very small and it takes a while for it to become cumulative. But again, that generation of leaders across spaces is so very important if we're going to, you know, keep ensuring that that change continues to happen, and especially on an even bigger scale.
And I think that's a wonderful note to end this webinar on. Hope and belief in the fact that they will change. So with that, thank you so much for joining us. And you're welcome. Yes, wishing us a wonderful weekend.
Absolutely. Battling load shedding, but you know, I think we're getting used to it now, hey?
Thank you so much, Rufaro.
Absolutely. Speak to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.